Some stories just make me wonder, is this the world's worst criminal? Brynhild Paulsdottir Storseth was born on November 11th, 1859, in the small village of Selbu, Norway. The youngest of 8 children in a farming family, Brunhild was tall for her age, strong, and was able to hold her own working alongside the men in the village. This went fairly well with Norway's unforgiving long winters, meager harvests, and endless labor. And although she was a tough, hard-working girl, she was known to be quick-tempered. She could also be vengeful with little empathy for those around her. At the young age of 14, she decided she wanted to move to New York in the United States. She used her hard work ethic to save money while she worked milking and herding cows at nearby farms. It was a dream that would take years to realize, but finally, in 1881, then at the age of 22, that dream came true. When she signed her name on the immigration paperwork, she decided that she would go by the name Belle. When she first arrived, she worked as a domestic servant, scrubbing floors and cooking meals for wealthy families. However, Belle wasn't content to live a life of service. She wanted the American dream, money, property, and security, and she was willing to do whatever it took to get them. In 1884, she married a fellow Norwegian immigrant named Mads Sorensen and moved to Chicago. The couple opened a small candy store there, but business was poor, and shortly after it opened, the shop mysteriously burned down. Fortunately, the insurance payout covered their losses, and the family was able to buy a new home in Austin, Illinois. This was Belle's first taste of how profitable misfortune could turn out to be, and it seemed to really stick with her. Mysterious tragedies became the norm in Belle's life. Over the next several years, the Sorensen household would see many. Several of their children died in infancy, reportedly from acute colitis. However, this diagnosis could also match the symptoms of poisoning. Neighbors found it strange, and gossip ran rampant, but infant mortality was sadly common in the 19th century, and eventually the issue and the children were forgotten. Mads Sorensen himself died suddenly from a cerebral hemorrhage on July 30th, 1900, and that death could not be more fortuitous for Belle. Mads had 2 insurance policies, one which expired at the end of July 30th, and the other which took effect at the start of that same day. His death happened to occur precisely when those 2 policies overlapped, and Belle collected both payouts, totaling thousands of dollars. This would finally give her the fortune that she felt she deserved. When questioned, she claimed that Mads had come home that day with a headache, so she gave him a dose of quinine powder for the pain. Later, when she went to check on him, she found him dead. His family didn't believe her explanation and called for an inquiry, but in the end, no charges were filed against her. With her newfound wealth, Belle left Chicago behind. In 1901, she moved to LaPorte, Indiana, and purchased a 48-acre farm on the outskirts of town. The neighbors described her as hardworking, but unfriendly, a woman who rarely smiled and carried herself with an air of grim determination. Factoring in her build and her strength, she wasn't someone that the locals were going to mess with. The next year, she married a man named Peter Gunness, a fellow Norwegian immigrant. Within a week of the wedding, tragedy would happen to strike again. Peter's infant daughter from a previous marriage died mysteriously while alone in Belle's care. 8 months later, Peter would be dead as well, with Belle claiming that a meat grinder had fallen from a shelf while he was reaching for something else. It supposedly fell on his head, killing him instantly. The coroner was suspicious, and another inquiry was launched, but ultimately it was ruled an accident. Of course, Belle had yet another insurance policy on her husband, and, once again, she collected all the money. In the years that followed, Belle began to take in foster children. On the surface, it made her appear generous and motherly, a widow opening her home to those in need, but neighbors often noticed that something was off. The children were quiet and withdrawn. While most seemed to live uneventful lives under Belle's watch, some were said to have run off, never to be seen again. However, her new role as a foster mother would become an important part of this story. Now twice widowed, Belle decided to find someone else. She began placing personal ads in Norwegian language newspapers across the Midwest. Quote, "Widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit." The responses to Belle's ads poured in. Suitors traveled from Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Minnesota, lured by her promises. Some even arrived at the farm with their possessions and cash in hand. Once they were inside Belle's farmhouse, the suitors seemed to mysteriously vanish. Now, you might think all these deaths and disappearances would cause suspicion or even trigger an investigation. However, at this time, state records were not connected by any type of technology, and she had somehow dodged the inquiries that were launched, so Belle's activities went almost unnoticed, even though they were gossiped about in local circles. Also consider that many of these men were immigrants themselves, with little in terms of close family ties in America. When relatives did inquire, Belle would send letters explaining that their loved ones had returned home, moved west, or simply left of their own accord. In some cases, she claimed they had broken her heart and run off, leaving her destitute. So far, everyone had believed the widow. Sadly, no one suspected the truth. Death had become Belle's business. After luring men to her farm, she would drug them, murder them, and bury their bodies in her hog pen or the orchard. Sometimes she dismembered them before feeding their remains to her hogs. For years, Belle's deadly enterprise continued unchecked. Each time she pocketed their savings, their jewelry, and their valuables, adding to her growing wealth. In 1908, all of this would change. Belle had taken in a farmhand named Ray Lamphere, a man who fell madly in love with her. When Belle eventually fired him and turned him away, he grew jealous and angry. He threatened to expose her secrets. Ray not only loved her, but he had actually helped her dispose of some of her victims. Whenever anyone asked her about Ray's grumblings, Belle would tell them that Ray was crazy. But more and more relatives of missing suitors began demanding answers. One man's brother pressed local authorities to investigate further, him being convinced that Mel had murdered his brother. As suspicion hit its peak in April, Belle's farmhouse suddenly burned to the ground. When the fire was extinguished, investigators found the bodies of 3 of her foster children in the ruins, along with the remains of a woman who was believed to be Belle. There were issues with this identification, though, as the woman's head was missing, and when the autopsy was performed, Belle was now 5 inches shorter and 50 pounds lighter than she should have been. Some believe that this wasn't Belle at all, and she had somehow escaped yet again. Later, on May 16th, a jawbone was recovered from the burned wreckage of the house, and dental work done on those remains was verified to have come from a local dentist. He would testify that it was indeed his work, and it was done just a year prior on Belle. The corpse was also wearing Belle's jewelry. Even with what seemed like a strong confirmation, many still believed that Belle was alive and well. As the investigation continued, searchers dug up the property, and what they found shocked the nation. Buried in shallow graves and in her hog pens were the remains of numerous men. Each had been dismembered, they were decomposed, and largely unrecognizable. The press would run wild with this story, saying that it was believed that she had killed more than 40 people between 1884 and 1908. However, for actual confirmed remains, we have about a dozen. But Belle's body count was also stated by someone close to her, and she wasn't the only criminal in the sights of investigators. Ray Lamphere was arrested and accused of setting the fire out of jealousy. At his trial, he also insisted that Belle was still alive and claimed that she had fled the house before it burned down. He pled guilty to the arson, but after being in jail for less than a year, Ray became sick with consumption. On his deathbed, he allegedly confessed that Belle had admitted to him the murdering of dozens of men. The mystery of did Belle survive the fire has persisted through the years. In 2008, DNA was taken from a letter written by Belle and compared to DNA that had been saved from the headless body found after the fire. Due to the age of the samples, though, nothing conclusive was found. To this day, the fate of Belle Gunness is a mystery. However, what is certain is that Belle Gunness earned her place as one of the most infamous female serial killers in American history. Her cold efficiency, lack of empathy, and her ability to operate in plain sight while avoiding detection still shocks the public. She has become a dark, morbid legend, and certainly one of the world's worst criminals.